There is a peculiar kind of treasure that can sit in a house for decades without attracting the slightest attention. It may be a children's book with a battered cover, a paperback with an orange spine, an old cookbook marked by years of use, or a heavy leather volume that looks more like furniture than something anyone would actually read. Most of these books are ordinary. Some are worth very little, but a small number can be remarkably different, and the difference is often hidden in places most people never bother to inspect. A date on the title page, a tiny number on the spine, a particular publisher, an original dust jacket, a printing error, even a handwritten inscription can completely change the story. That is what makes old books so fascinating. Their value is often not visible from across the room. So, before an old shelf disappears into a charity shop, a house clearance, or a cardboard box, there are certain books worth examining properly. Not because every old book is valuable, but because the rare ones can look remarkably similar to the ordinary ones surrounding them. Today, we are working through 17 examples, beginning with the more accessible possibilities and gradually moving toward books whose histories reach into the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, and eventually into the extraordinary world of multi-million-dollar literary treasures. And there is an important principle to remember throughout the list. Age alone does not create value. Rarity, condition, edition, provenance, survival, and historical importance can matter far more. With that in mind, let's begin. Number 17. Ladybird books. Few books look less like valuable collectibles than the small, colourful ladybird books that once appeared in children's bedrooms and school bags across Britain. They were produced in enormous numbers, and that fact is precisely why most examples remain inexpensive. Finding an old ladybird book does not automatically mean finding money. The interesting examples are the early ones. Scarcer titles from the 1940s and 1950s, particularly copies that still have their original dust jackets, can command substantially more than the ordinary examples. Some can reach hundreds, while particularly scarce copies have entered the four-figure range. The dust jacket is especially important because these thin paper covers were rarely treated as something worth preserving. Children handled the books, parents removed the jackets. They were torn, lost, or simply thrown away. And that creates an unusual situation for collectors. The book itself may have survived because it was sturdy enough to remain on a shelf for generations, while the fragile part that makes the surviving copy special may have disappeared almost immediately after purchase. So if you have a box of old ladybird books, do not simply count how many there are. Look at the earliest titles, examine the dates, and pay attention to whether an original jacket has survived. The ordinary copies are still ordinary. The scarce survivors are another story. Number 16. Early penguin paperbacks. The orange and white penguin spine is one of the most recognizable designs in 20th century publishing. Millions of these books were produced, which means most old penguins are not rare treasures. But early numbers are where the story becomes much more interesting. The first penguin books appeared in 1935, and the earliest numbered titles, particularly numbers 1 through 10, are seriously collected when found in good condition. One title that collectors recognize immediately is Ariel by André Maurois, among those earliest penguin publications. There is an important detail here that is easy to miss. Some early penguin paperbacks were issued with dust jackets. Today, it is natural to think of a paperback as something that never had a jacket at all, but those early examples can be very different from the mass-market paperbacks most people know. That fragile jacket can transform the desirability of a copy. So if you find a row of old penguins, do not judge them by their worn covers or by the fact that they are paperbacks. Look at the numbers, check the earliest publications, and if an original jacket is still present, examine it carefully. A low number is not a guarantee of a fortune, but it is certainly a reason to stop before putting the whole shelf into a box. Number 15. Wisden Cricketers' Almanacs. The little yellow Wisden volumes have an unusual quality that makes them almost feel like historical records rather than ordinary books. A new edition appears each year, creating a long chronological sequence that can stretch across generations of cricketing history. Modern examples are generally modestly priced. The early editions are where things change. Wisden has been published annually since 1864, and the Victorian volumes can be worth thousands. Complete runs have also reached much higher values, while wartime editions can attract attention because paper shortages affected production. That makes the date on the spine one of the first things worth checking. If an old cricketing collection contains anything from before 1900, it deserves a closer look. And this is a useful lesson about collectibles in general. Wear does not always destroy value. A book that has survived for well over a century is expected to show some evidence of its journey. A worn Victorian Wisden is not automatically a damaged modern collectible. The very fact that it has survived can be part of its appeal. The danger is not that the book looks old. The danger is that nobody checks the date. Number 14. Old cookery books. Few books are treated as disposable as old cookery books. They are stained. They are taped together. Pages are covered with fingerprints. Recipes may have been written in the margins. Some look as though they have spent half a century beside a cooker. And normally, that means very little. But rarity can overcome appearance. An early edition of Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, including the 1861 edition, can be worth thousands. Early culinary publications, unusual baking books, confectionery titles, and handwritten family recipe books can also attract collectors. The fascinating part is that the damage sometimes tells the story of the book. A rare cookbook that was genuinely used by a family is still a rare cookbook. The stains do not magically make it valuable, of course. Condition remains important. But a collector does not necessarily expect a 19th century working cookbook to look untouched. So, the next time you find a battered cookbook at the back of a cupboard, resist the temptation to judge it by appearance. Open it, find the title page, read the date, and look for handwriting. A book covered in the evidence of family life can sometimes be much more interesting than the pristine modern edition sitting beside it. Number 13. Rupert and Children's Annuals. Children's annuals create one of the strangest traps in collecting. They were designed to be used by children, and children were remarkably good at doing exactly that. Pages were read repeatedly, covers were bent, corners were damaged, spines were pulled apart. Some books disappeared altogether. That is why early survivors can be surprisingly desirable. The first Rupert Annual from 1936, in fine condition, has reached more than £20,000, according to the reference material, while wartime Rupert Annuals can also command hundreds or thousands because relatively fragile wartime paper was used during a period of rationing. Early Beano and Dandy annuals can also attract collectors, while the earliest issues of the comics themselves can become considerably more valuable. With annuals, the date is one of your first clues. Then look closely at the spine and corners. And there is an irony here that appears repeatedly in children's collecting. The book with the strongest childhood memories may be the most heavily worn one. The forgotten annual, sitting untouched because nobody particularly cared about it, may be the better survivor. In other words, the book nobody loved enough to read can sometimes become the one collectors want most. Number 12. Enid Blyton First Editions. Enid Blyton's books were printed in enormous quantities, which makes it easy to assume that an old Blyton is automatically common. For many ordinary reading copies, that assumption is perfectly reasonable. The important distinction is between an old copy and a genuine early edition. Early first editions of titles such as the famous 5 and Secret 7 books can attract hundreds, and particularly desirable copies can reach into the thousands. 5 on a Treasure Island, the first famous 5 book from 1942, is a good example of why edition and condition matter. The dust jacket is particularly significant. 2 copies can contain exactly the same story, be the same age, and look broadly similar on a shelf, yet one can be worth many times the other simply because the original jacket has survived. That is why a dust jacket should never be treated as disposable packaging. For a potentially important Blyton, examine the copyright page, publication information, date, publisher details, and jacket carefully. The name of the author may get your attention. The edition is what tells you whether you should keep looking. Number 11. Agatha Christie First Editions. Agatha Christie presents another classic example of the difference between popularity and collectability. Her books are everywhere. Book club editions are everywhere. Later paperbacks are everywhere. So it would be a mistake to assume that an old Christie novel is automatically valuable. But early first editions are a completely different category. The Mysterious Affair at Styles, first published in 1921, is especially important because it was Christie's first novel. Early copies can be worth thousands, and copies with desirable dust jackets can rise considerably higher. The publisher information matters here. A collector is not simply looking for the words Agatha Christie on a title page. They are trying to establish exactly which edition they are looking at. The same principle applies throughout this entire list. The famous author gets you interested. The bibliographic details tell you what you actually have, and that distinction can be the difference between an ordinary book and a serious collectible. Number 10. The original Winnie-the-Pooh books. There are children's books that become part of popular culture, and then there are books that become cultural landmarks. The original A. Milne books featuring Winnie-the-Pooh belong firmly in the second category. The 4 original books from the 1920s include When We Were Very Young, Winnie-the-Pooh, Now We Are 6, and The House at Pooh Corner. First editions in original dust jackets can be worth thousands, while fine sets can reach tens of thousands. Signed copies can command still greater attention. The publication dates are especially useful. The books span the period from 1924 through 1928. And then there is the publisher, Methuen. Those details give you a starting point for identifying an early copy. But there is also something more emotional about these books. They were nursery books. They were read by children, handled by families, and passed from one generation to another. That means many surviving copies are heavily worn. A modern collector may be looking at something that once seemed almost disposable to the family that owned it. That is one of the recurring mysteries of old books. The objects people considered ordinary are often the ones whose survival tells the most interesting stories. Number 9. Beatrix Potter. Now we reach a book where scarcity becomes dramatically more important. Almost everyone recognizes Peter Rabbit. That familiarity might make it seem like an unlikely candidate for a major collectible. But the earliest Peter Rabbit books are not ordinary modern children's books. Beatrix Potter privately published the first version of The Tale of Peter Rabbit in 1901, with only 250 copies produced. That extremely limited beginning is what makes those early examples so important. According to the reference material, surviving private copies have reached the £40,000 to £60,000 range and beyond, while early commercial printings from Frederick Warne in 1902 can also be worth thousands. This is a perfect example of why collectors care about the earliest version of a famous object. Millions of people may recognize Peter Rabbit. Very few people can own one of the earliest surviving copies. And that difference is the entire story. If an old Peter Rabbit book appears in a cupboard, do not assume that the familiar character means it is merely a common children's reprint. Look at the date, look at the publisher, look at the binding and physical characteristics. If it appears to belong to those earliest years, that is the moment to stop treating it as an ordinary children's book and have it examined professionally. Number 8. Old Bibles. Old Bibles require a little more honesty than the title of this video might suggest. The enormous Victorian family Bible is not automatically a valuable antique. In fact, many are relatively common, and their size alone does not make them desirable. But Bibles occupy a fascinating place in the history of books because some exceptionally early or unusual examples can be extremely valuable. Books printed before about 1700 can attract serious attention. Early editions, such as the Geneva Bible and unusual printing error Bibles, are especially interesting. And then there is something that has nothing to do with the printed text at all: the family pages. Births, marriages, deaths. Names written in generations of handwriting. Letters, flowers, other flat objects tucked between the pages. A Bible could serve as a family's private archive for decades, sometimes centuries. That means an old Bible should not simply be valued by looking at its leather cover. Open it, read the title page, check the date, then examine the pages carefully. The printed book may be historically significant, while the handwritten material can give it an entirely different human dimension. And keep that thought in mind, because the story of old Bibles reaches an extraordinary conclusion near the top of this list. Number 7. Ian Fleming's first James Bond books. By the 1950s, James Bond had become one of the world's most recognizable fictional characters, but collectors are interested in the period before that fame became inevitable. Casino Royale, published in 1953, introduced Bond in book form, and an early first printing with its original dust jacket can be worth tens of thousands of pounds. Other early Bond first editions can also reach four-figure values. The lesson here is not simply that James Bond is famous, it is that the most desirable books often come from the moment before an author or character became an enormous cultural phenomenon. That is why the first edition matters, the original jacket matters, the publication details matter, and on more modern books, collectors may also examine the number line on the copyright page, where the presence of a particular numeral can help establish the printing. This is one of the most useful habits you can develop when examining old books. Do not judge the book from its cover. Turn it over, open it, read the publishing information. Sometimes the real story is hiding on a page nobody ever looks at. A moment to reconsider the bookshelf. At this point, something should be becoming clear. A bookshelf is deceptive. From across the room, 10 books can look almost identical. One may be a later reprint worth very little. Another may be an early edition. Another may have an original jacket. Another might contain a significant inscription, and one could potentially belong to an entirely different level of collecting. That is why the habit of valuing books by appearance alone can be so misleading. A shelf is not really a collection until somebody has examined what is on it. And now, the differences become even more dramatic. Number 6. Signed and inscribed books. A signature can increase the appeal of a book, but an inscription can sometimes tell a much bigger story. There is an important distinction between a book simply signed by its author and a book inscribed to somebody who had a meaningful connection with that author. Collectors sometimes refer to the latter as an association copy. In that situation, the book is no longer just a signed object. It becomes a piece of biography. The words written inside the book can connect it to another person, a professional relationship, a friendship, or an important moment in the author's life. That is why you should never ignore handwriting inside an old book. Look at book plates. Look at the front end papers. Read inscriptions completely and pay attention to the recipient's name. A simple message can be worth far less than an inscription that establishes a meaningful connection. There is a wonderful lesson here. The value may not be in the printed story at all. It may be in the story that happened after the book left the publisher. Number 5. The Hobbit. Few books demonstrate the power of an early children's edition better than Tolkien's The Hobbit. The first printing appeared in 1937 with only 1,500 copies produced, according to the reference material. That limited original production is one reason surviving first impressions are so important. A first impression can reach the tens of thousands of pounds, particularly when accompanied by a desirable dust jacket. Even certain later impressions from the 1930s can command thousands, while early Lord of the Rings editions can also enter 4- and 5-figure territory. For The Hobbit, the identifying details become crucial. Collectors look for George Allen and Unwin, the 1937 publication, and the first impression. That is not information you can reliably establish by glancing at the cover. You have to inspect the book itself. And once again, the children's section of a house becomes an unexpectedly interesting place to search. Families bought these books for children. They were not necessarily thinking about future collectors. They were thinking about bedtime stories. That is precisely how important first editions can spend decades hiding in completely ordinary homes. Number 4. The Dust Jacket. This is not one particular title. It is one of the most important ideas in the entire world of 20th century book collecting. The dust jacket. To a tidy housekeeper, a dust jacket can look like an inconvenient piece of paper that gets torn, bent, or removed. To a collector, it can be the most important part of the book. In some cases, the jacket can be worth more than the book itself. One of the clearest examples is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. A 1925 first edition without its original jacket can be worth thousands of dollars. A desirable copy with the famous jacket can reach 6 figures, while exceptional examples have sold for $250,000. That difference is astonishing, and it explains why so many valuable books lost their most important component decades ago. People removed jackets to keep shelves tidy. They discarded them when they became damaged. They replaced them with homemade covers. They simply did not understand their importance. So if you find an old dust jacket, even one that is torn or worn, do not throw it away. Do not tape it, do not trim it, do not try to improve it. And if you find a loose jacket in a drawer or box, keep it with the books you think it may belong to. A seemingly worthless piece of paper may be the missing part that turns an ordinary-looking book into something collectors actively want. Number 3. Printing errors and unusual states. Collectors are often drawn to perfection. Book collecting has a fascinating exception. Sometimes the mistake is what makes the book desirable. A printing error can lead to a particular edition being recalled, corrected, or produced only briefly. A changed binding, an incorrect piece of text, or another unusual production detail can leave behind a scarce version that collectors specifically seek. This is where ordinary-looking books become particularly difficult to identify. The valuable difference may be a single word, a particular line, a tiny production detail, something that cannot possibly be seen while the book is sitting on a shelf. That is why experienced collectors use detailed identification guides when examining potentially important first editions. The title alone is not enough. The author is not enough. Even the year is sometimes not enough. The exact printing state can matter. And this is perhaps the strongest argument for slowing down when you find an old book. You do not need to know everything about every collectible. You simply need to recognize when a book deserves a closer examination. Number 2. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Some modern books become collectible because of scarcity. Others become collectible because they captured the beginning of a cultural phenomenon. The first edition of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone combines both. The true first printing from 1997 consisted of only 500 copies, according to the reference material, with many going to libraries. That is a tiny number when compared with the enormous global readership that followed. And genuine first copies have several identifying characteristics. The publisher is Bloomsbury. The copyright page printing line contains the relevant early sequence. The author's name appears as Joanne Rowling. And on page 53, there is a distinctive repetition involving the list of school equipment. These details matter because later editions and film-related paperbacks can look similar to an inexperienced eye. But similarity is not identity. Auction results for genuine early copies have reached tens of thousands of pounds, with exceptional examples selling for more than $100,000 in the American market, according to the reference material. That is an extraordinary transformation. A book purchased for a child at the beginning of a new literary phenomenon could eventually become a serious collectible. And that is exactly why modern books should not always be dismissed simply because they are not ancient. Sometimes rarity is created by timing. Number 1. The books that look like nothing special. The final example is not really a single title. It is a category of book that people often overlook precisely because it does not look impressive. An old leather-bound volume, a plain cover, a book filled with unfamiliar language, something that looks like sermons, classical texts, or forgotten scholarship. In many houses, these books are treated as decorative objects rather than historical artifacts. And most old leather books are not fortunes. But the earliest printed books occupy a completely different world. Books produced in the 15th and 16th centuries can represent some of the earliest surviving stages of European printing. Early editions of major literary and religious works can become extraordinarily important. One of the clearest examples is Shakespeare's First Folio, published in 1623. In 2020, a copy sold at auction in New York for $9.98 million, according to the reference material. That is almost $10 million for a book that, to someone unfamiliar with its history, could simply look like an old folio sitting on a shelf. But even that remarkable figure is not the highest point. The Codex Sassoon, an ancient handwritten Hebrew Bible more than 1,000 years old, sold at auction in New York for $38.1 million. $38 million for a single book. And suddenly, the ordinary-looking volumes around your own home begin to seem a little different. Not because your old leather book is likely to be worth millions, it almost certainly is not. But because appearance tells you almost nothing about historical importance. A book can be plain, it can be worn, it can be missing the sort of decorative features that make an object immediately attractive. And yet its significance can be hidden in the title page, the printer, the date, the provenance, or the history of its survival. That is what makes old books so different from many other collectibles. You cannot always identify the important ones from across the room.